And it gives me great joy to introduce to you Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin.
I was told that if Jim didn't move the microphone, then I could. So this is what we're doing. I like to walk around when I speak, so that whole static thing I can't be doing with. It's a great pleasure to be here. I married a cowboy, in fact. And I have to say, I'm pleasantly surprised that any of you are here right now. Or is the game still on? Oh, okay, so well done for being here. I'm guessing you all have earpieces in so you can actually keep track of the score instead of listening to what I'm saying. So at various points, I'm just going to ask you, what's the score? And if you know it too quickly, then I've found you out. The first time I ever visited Oklahoma, which was, I think, before Brian and I were married, we were just dating at the time. And he took me to the homecoming game at Oklahoma State. I have to tell you, I married the only man from Oklahoma who does not care about sport, like not even a little bit. So we're at this game, and at one point, I got my hand in the air, I'm going like this, and he goes, what are you doing with your hand? I said, well, I'm doing what the other 10,000 people are doing. We're going to go, that's good for a cowboy, first down. And he didn't even know what the hand gestures were. So I married a very good man who's a little bit of a disgrace to his alma mater. And we've been married for the last 16 years. He dragged me over the pond from the UK, honestly kicking and screaming, I hate to say this, but I've been thankful to be here for the last 16 years. His argument was, as an American in the UK, he felt like he was always having to kind of justify himself, and he was like, as a Brit in America, people are going to like you for no reason. So here we are. And because I am a Brit, I can't help talking about Harry Potter. Now, I've got to ask you, raise your hand if you have read the books or seen the films of Harry Potter. Okay. If you have not read the books or seen the films, then I need to block your ears for the next couple of minutes, because I'm going to drop the most horrific spoiler, and I would hate to ruin it for you. Though they've been out for a little while, I actually noticed there was like a whole section over here that hadn't. So maybe you guys can put your fingers in your ears. They've been out for a while, so it's on you if I ruin this. But fair warning, put your fingers in your ears. Because if you have read the books or seen the films, I'm sure you remember the devastating moment in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, when J.K. Rowling basically sticks a knife into all of our hearts. If you don't know the books, Dumbledore is kind of like the Gandalf of the series, if you're more of a Tolkien person. He's the only man whose power for good can match Lord Voldemort's evil. But in the 6th book, a weakened Dumbledore stands at the top of the astronomy tower, surrounded by his enemies, and he appeals to Harry's teacher nemesis, Severus Snape, for help. Severus, please. And Snape kills him. The scene is absolutely devastating. We never liked Professor Snape, but we hope beyond hope that he was Dumbledore's man, and now his betrayal of his mentor is complete. It's only in the last book that we realize how wrong we were. When Harry dives into the Pensieve, that magical bowl where you can dive into somebody else's past. And there we discover that everything Snape has done has been driven by his passionate, hopeless, unrequited love for Harry's mother. We see Snape's anguish as Lily Potter is murdered by Voldemort, and how he thenceforth commits himself to Dumbledore. We hear Dumbledore telling Snape that he is dying from the slow workings of an irreversible curse, and making Snape promise to kill him when the moment comes. And suddenly, the meaning of Severus, please, is reversed. When my non-Christian friends in Cambridge, Massachusetts, look over at the Christian faith, they see a lot of things that look like Snape killing Dumbledore. They see a white-centered religion with a history of racism and scriptures that condone slavery. They see an anti-intellectual mindset and a contradictory Bible that's been disproved by science again and again. They see homophobia, the denigration of women, and a refusal to acknowledge that love is love. But just as when Harry dived into Snape's memories, his perception of what Snape had done completely reversed. So I think that when we look more closely at each of these seemingly devastating roadblocks to faith in Jesus, they actually become a signpost. I think many in our churches today believe that really Christianity is on the way out. The best thing we can do is to sort of batten down the hatches and cling on for dear life as the waves of secularization wash over us. And I understand that that's how we can feel. But if that's what we think, I believe we've got it all wrong. I don't think the tide is going out on Christianity. I think it's coming in. I think we have an extraordinary gospel opportunity in this cultural moment. But in order to grasp that opportunity, there are 4 things that we must do. Number 1, we must reclaim diversity. Number 2, we must reclaim the university. Number 3, we must reclaim morality. And number 4, we must reclaim sexuality. But we must do all of these things with humility and not by watering the scriptures down, but by lapping them up. So number 1, we must reclaim diversity. On the 23rd of February of 2019, a Nigerian street preacher named Olewale Ilasanmi stood outside a train station in London, where I come from, preaching to the commuters as they went by. 2 white British police officers came up to him and gave him a choice: go away or be arrested. I will not go away, Mr. Ilasanmi replied, because I need to tell them the truth. And Jesus is the only way, the truth, and the life. They don't want to listen to that, one of the officers said. They want you to go away. You don't want to listen to that, Mr. Ilasanmi replied. You will listen when you are dead. You will listen when you are dead. And so he was arrested. What do we make of this story? Are we encouraged by our brother's faith? I certainly am. Are we reminded that preaching the gospel always comes at a cost, and that we Western Christians have got far too used to a comfortable life, for sure? But a black African Christian preaching the exclusive message of Jesus while white Westerners block their ears is actually a little parable for the religious world today. See, 40 years ago, all the sociologists of religion thought that as the world became more modern, more scientific, more educated, that religious belief would naturally decline. It's what had happened in Western Europe, where I'm from, and where Western Europe leads, the rest of the world must follow, right? Wrong. In the last 40 years, not only has religion in general and Christianity in particular failed to decline globally, as the experts thought that it would, but now as they look out over the next 40 years, they're actually anticipating an increasingly religious world. Right now, Christianity is by far the largest belief system in the world, with about 31% of people identifying as Christian. That proportion is set to increase slightly to 32% by 2060. Islam is the second largest global belief system, and the proportion of self-identified Muslims in the world is set to increase quite significantly from about 25% to 31%, making it a very close competitor with Christianity. Hinduism and Buddhism are the next 2 largest religions, and they are set to decline slightly in that time frame. But the real shock is this. The proportion of people who do not say they're affiliated with any religion, so that includes people who would say they were atheists, agnostics, or who would just check none on a census form when they're asked, what is your religion? That proportion is set to decline from 16% to 13%. The tide isn't going out on religion, it's coming in. I'm guessing this comes as a surprise to many of our non-Christian friends. But what's perhaps even more surprising is that Christianity is the belief system of diversity. If you look across the world today, if you look in terms of culture and race and geography and ethnicity and socioeconomics, Christianity is by far not only the largest, but also the most diverse belief system in the world. If we look in America, On average, black Americans are as much as 10 percentage points more likely to identify as Christians than their white peers. And also rank higher on every other measure of Christian commitment, whether it's regular church attendance or Bible reading or prayer or core evangelical beliefs, whether or not that name would be used. A lot of Americans express concern that immigration is eroding America's Christian heritage. In actual fact, immigration is a much-needed blood transfusion for the American church. There's people from all over the world actually coming here to worship Jesus. As Jim mentioned, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in Somerville, which is one of the adjacent cities to Cambridge, English is the third most commonly spoken language at evangelical churches after Portuguese and Creole. Now, if we're followers of Jesus, this should excite us, but it shouldn't surprise us. The first century Jewish man we worship broke through every racial and cultural barrier of his day, and he commanded his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. They began almost at once. We meet the first black Christian in the book of Acts, the Ethiopian eunuch of Acts chapter 8. And Ethiopia went on to become one of the first officially Christian states in the world, before St. Patrick ever went to Ireland and centuries before the gospel came to America. We see in the New Testament epistles this extraordinary vision of people from all sorts of different racial and ethnic backgrounds coming together as one body in Christ. And we see in the book of Revelation at the end of the Bible this amazing picture of people from every tribe and tongue and nation worshiping Jesus together. This is our destiny. And in meaningful ways, this is becoming our reality. Now, I don't say any of this to excuse or to gloss over the history of profound racial injustice, especially racial injustice perpetrated by people who look like me against our black brothers and sisters. But the reality is, if we open our Bibles, we will find that all of that injustice is profoundly sinful. You know, the problem with the 60s segregationists was not that they were too Christian, so they weren't half Christian enough. It wasn't that they were reading their Bibles too carefully, so they're utterly failing to take their lead from what the scriptures say. In fact, if you look back through history, Christianity is the original and best foundation for love across racial difference. Now, when my non-Christian friends hear the word evangelism, they imagine white Westerners forcing their beliefs down other people's throats. But when they realize that actually most Christians around the world are neither white nor Western, and increasingly most evangelists are neither white nor Western either, then the exclusive message of Jesus becomes harder to dismiss. Because when Mr. Ilasami said to those two white British police officers that Jesus is the only way, the truth, and the life, he wasn't saying, my culture's cooking is better than yours. He was saying, I was starving too till I found bread. So let's reclaim diversity, because Christianity is the most multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural movement in all of history. Second, we must reclaim the university. A few years ago, I invited a friend of mine who was a professor at Harvard, a professor of the natural sciences at Harvard, to an event at Harvard where New Testament scholar N.T. Wright was in dialogue with the agnostic chair of the Harvard philosophy department. The title of the event was The Bible, Gospel, Guide, or Garbage. Now, my friend is culturally Jewish and convictionally atheist. And after the event, I said to him, I know that you think that what I believe is crazy. His then girlfriend, who was a much gentler soul than either of us, said, oh, I'm sure he doesn't think that. I said, yes, he does. I believe that the entirety of human history revolves around a first century Jewish man who died on a cross and was supposedly raised to life 3 days later. Crazy, right? My friend said yes. I said, the problem is, I think that you believe some crazy things as well. See, from many people's perspective today, they look over at Christianity and they think they're comparing Christianity with all our crazy beliefs to a perfectly coherent secular worldview that does all the work that Christianity does without having to believe in crazy things. But there is no such belief system. And in actual fact, I think in the coming years, people in the West are going to have to start reckoning with Christianity again. One of the amazing things that's happening in the world at the moment in terms of the global growth of Christianity is what's happening in China. And China right now is the global center of atheism. But the church in China is growing so fast that experts think there will be soon more Christians in China than in America, and that by 2060, China could even be a majority Christian country. Now, the sociologist of religion in China who predicts this is a man named Fan Gengyang, who's at Purdue University. And he wrote an article about the failure of the secularization hypothesis. So the reality that whereas sociologists thought that the world becoming more modern, scientific, and educated would mean that religious belief would decline, the fact that just hasn't come true. And he says that the university in the West is going to have to go through what he calls a paradigm shift, much like a scientific revolution, when the failure of the secularization hypothesis comes home to roost. You see, for decades now, the idea that the world is naturally just becoming less religious, and so we don't even have to take religious truth claims seriously anymore, that idea has functioned in the university not just as a diagnosis, but as a prescription. It's not just what will happen, but what should happen. So what are Western academics going to do when they realize that it hasn't happened? And that atheism, far from being the belief system of diversity and progress, is actually the belief system of white Western men and communist regimes. I think between now and when my little son, Luke, who's 5, is in university, there's going to have to be an earthquake in terms of how people think. Now again, this should excite us, but it shouldn't surprise us. As Jim mentioned, Jesus calls us to love God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength. He's not content with 3 out of 4. Now, it's understandable that many people have this impression that Christianity is anti-intellectual. There have been some good reasons for that. And one of the reasons, I think, is that as Christians, we recognize the gospel is simple. It's simple enough for a young child or somebody with a mental disability to understand. And sometimes we take that and we kind of project from that to assume that actually Christianity isn't intellectually curious and respectable. But actually, if you look back over the last 2,000 years of Christian history, you'll find that Christians have written some of the greatest literature of all time. You'll find that Christians have dreamt up some of the greatest philosophy of all time. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, you'll find that what we now call science was first developed by Christians, not as an alternative hypothesis to belief in a creator God, but actually because they believed in a creator God who is both rational and free. The guy who first explained this to me is a man called Hans Halvorsen, who's a professor at Princeton. He's a professor of the philosophy of science and of mathematics. And he's probably one of the top 4 philosophers of science in the world. And he says not only is it the case historically that what we now call science was developed by Christians because of their belief in the God of the Bible, but actually he says even today, science rests more firmly on Christian foundations than on atheist ones. In fact, he says atheism doesn't give you a philosophical foundation for science at all. Now, you may be familiar with my famous fellow countryman, Richard Dawkins. He's a little less, I think, well-known now than he was 10 or 20 years ago, but Richard Dawkins was one of the sort of new atheists who took it upon themselves, among other things, to enlighten all of us about the fact that science has clearly disproved belief in a creator God. And in particular, the New Atheists would like to kind of take us through a tour of Christian history and a tour of the history of science and say, look how time and again there's been all these debates and these fights between Christians on the one hand and scientists on the other. And guess what? The scientists always win. Now, that's the story that Richard Dawkins and his New Atheist friends like to tell. But in actual fact, if you look back over all of these famous controversies, you'll notice that there are Bible-believing Christians on both sides. And if you look back through the history of science, you'll notice that there have been very serious Christians who have been at the forefront of scientific discovery in a whole range of fields. I actually live down the road from MIT, the sort of high temple of science in the US. And I know a number of very serious Christians there, many of whom actually became Christians when they were already scientists, or at least at the student level, when they were sort of still figuring stuff out, not necessarily even raised in Christian families and just sort of carrying on with what they've been told. So we have this idea that science and faith are kind of pulling in diametrically opposing directions. But actually, if we look more carefully at the history, we'll find that they're not. Now, I'm not trying to oversimplify things. The fact is, Christians have been debating amongst each other how the scriptures fit with science since at least the 4th century. I'm not saying that there are kind of easy and simple fixes or ways to understand. But actually, if you look at the world through the lens of atheism, you have all sorts of problems that you need to reckon with as well when it comes to understanding science. So let's not concede science to the atheists. Instead, let's encourage those in this room who might be practicing scientists. Let's encourage those young people in this room who might have been given a really serious brain by God to use that mind and that capacity to his glory. Let's raise our children and grandchildren to be the most intellectually curious people in town, because Christianity actually isn't anti-intellectual. It's the greatest intellectual movement in all of history. Number 3, we must reclaim morality. Last month, I had the privilege of visiting Australia with my family in tow. I had some speaking events in Australia, and the host had kindly kind of offered to bring my crew out with me, because really, you can't go to Australia for less than like at least 2 weeks, and I can't leave my kids for more than 2 weeks. So that was the deal. And one of the most delightful things about Australia was a woman called Sarah Irving Stonebreaker. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. So Sarah was one of the few people who knew both me and my husband Brian before we knew each other. She went to the same college as he did at Cambridge. Sarah was raised in a loving, secular home in Sydney, Australia. She went to Sydney University. She's incredibly intelligent. She won like a university medal in history. She got a scholarship to go to Cambridge to do her PhD. And when she arrived in Cambridge, she was a convinced atheist. She was then a convinced atheist when she went to Oxford to do her postdoctoral studies. And while she was at Oxford, she heard there was going to be a series of lectures by an Australian philosopher called Peter Singer, very sort of famous, influential Australian philosopher who was also an atheist. Sarah was super excited. She went along to these lectures. And Peter Singer is one of the atheist philosophers who takes very seriously the fact that if you're an atheist, you can't just kind of borrow Christian ethics and try to sort of wipe God off the surface. You actually have to build something from the ground up. And one of the things that Peter Singer says is that instead of assuming that all human beings are fundamentally equal because they're human, that instead we should evaluate beings, whether they're human or animal, on the basis of their capacities. So, for example, their capacity for self-awareness or their capacity for suffering, etc. And according to Peter Singer's calculation, a human infant is less morally valuable than an adult pig. Now, when my friend Sarah heard these lectures, she experienced what she later described as a sort of intellectual vertigo, as she realized that her atheism, far from supporting her deepest moral beliefs, actually stuck a knife in the back of them. And that realization started her on a journey of discovery, which ended in her putting her trust in Jesus. And when we saw her last month in Australia, it was the first time we've seen her in the flesh since she became a Christian. There are a few things more wonderful in life than meeting somebody who you knew as a non-Christian and who has now put their trust in Jesus. And I remember one night in particular, Brian saying, we were both listening to Sarah talking about Jesus, like just sort of, she was getting all excited and talking about something about the Lord. And it was almost like a kind of out-of-body experience for us, like hearing those words out of this person who we knew and loved when she was a very delightful, kind, highly intelligent, annoyingly beautiful atheist. And Sarah's not the only person who's realized that actually Christianity lies at the heart and offers the foundation for the moral beliefs that you and I and our neighbors and colleagues and family members who might not identify as Christians at all share. So my guess is if you walk down your street in your neighborhood, or if you went and talked to one of your colleagues or one of your friends from school, that regardless of how they would identify religiously or otherwise, that you would share certain moral beliefs with them. And my guess is that they would agree with you that all human beings are fundamentally morally equal. They would agree that men and women are equally valuable. They would agree that the strong and the rich and the powerful don't have any right to trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalized. And in fact, instead, that they should be caring for the weak and the poor and the marginalized. We tend to think of these things in our society as sort of self-evident truths, basic moral common sense. But actually, if you look at the history of thought, you'll find they're specifically Christian beliefs. It's an Israeli professor called Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote a global bestseller called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. Has anybody heard of that book or read it? A couple of people there. So he's coming at the history of humanity from a non-believing perspective, doesn't believe in God. And in his book, he makes casual remarks like this: Homo sapiens has no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights. He says human rights are figments of our fertile imaginations. Quoting the US Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Harari says, the Americans got the idea of human equality from Christianity. But if we stop believing in a God who made us and gave us souls and all that kind of thing, what does it even mean to say that humans are equal? He says the scientific study of Homo sapiens has embarrassingly little to do with human rights and equality. Or I think of another fellow countryman of mine, a guy called Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man Tom Holland, the historian Tom Holland. He identifies as agnostic. From the time when he was sort of a young boy, he became much more interested in the Greek and Roman gods than in the sort of seemingly pathetic hero of Christianity. And as an adult, he went on to become a professional historian. He writes books about history that also sell exceedingly well. And a few years ago, he set out to write a book which in the US is titled Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. It's looking back over the last 2,000 years of Christian history in the West. And in the course of his research for this book, Tom Holland realized that a lot of the beliefs that he held as an agnostic were actually Christian beliefs. And now he freely kind of admits and sort of tells anyone who is interested to listen that the basic moral beliefs that we and our neighbors share, whether they identify as atheist, agnostic, Jewish, Muslim, or Hindu, actually, in our Western contexts, these are profoundly Christian beliefs, and they're not ones that have just been kind of left around for us to find. They're ones that have come down to us from this extraordinary first century man known at the time as Jesus of Nazareth. So as we think about morality, we need to recognize the ways in which Christianity has actually laid the foundations for what we and our least Christian friends might share. But we also need to be a little bit careful. Because my guess is that a lot of people who are not Christians expect us Christians to be saying something like this: we're really good, come and be like us, right? You know, we're good people. If you became a Christian, you could be as good as we are. Now, if we're followers of Jesus, we should know that's actually pretty much the opposite of our message. Instead, if we have understood the gospel, what we're saying is, I'm so bad that I needed the Son of God to die for me so that I could be forgiven before God. We're not saying, I'm so good, come and be like me. We're saying Jesus is so good. Come and receive forgiveness from him. So I think we need to be careful in our conversations with friends about morality, to not come across as, and certainly to not be, the kind of self-righteous hypocrites that sometimes Christians are thought of as being. But at the same time, it's interesting that even Richard Dawkins has had to kind of reluctantly acknowledge that people who believe in God actually do behave in more prosocial ways than people who don't. There's actually quite a lot of evidence that, for instance, if you're a regular churchgoer, you're more like, you give substantially more money away, not just to Christian organizations, but actually to secular charities as well, than your secular peers will. You're less likely to engage in a whole bunch of kind of antisocial behaviors as well. You know, even Richard Dawkins has to acknowledge this, much as it irks him. We don't mind irking Richard Dawkins every now and then. So as we think about morality, let's reclaim it, but more like divers pulling treasure from a wreck. And let's flee self-righteousness like toxic waste. Number 4, we must reclaim sexuality. When Snape killed Dumbledore, all doubt in the reader's minds as to whether he was on the side of good or evil died as well. And when I, at least in Cambridge, Massachusetts, stand for Christian sexual ethics, I move over in people's minds from delusion to bigotry. But just as when Harry dived into Snape's memories, he found that Snape's story was not a story of hate, but a story of love. So I believe that when we dive into what the Bible has to say to us about sexuality, we find that it's a love story too. It's a much greater love story than we were ever ready for. This love story begins in the Old Testament as prophet after prophet compares God to a loving, faithful husband and Israel, his people, to his often unfaithful wife. You know, time and again, God is reaching out for his people and showing his people love and commitment and faithfulness and pursuing them. And time and again, God's people are cheating on God with idols and turning away from him. It's like this cosmic marriage is in crisis. And then Jesus comes. And one of the strange claims that Jesus made about himself was that he is the bridegroom. It's an odd thing for a man to say who lived all his life on earth and never got married. But actually, it's one of the many ways in which Jesus is stepping into the shoes of the covenant God of the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus is the bridegroom come to claim God's people for himself. We see in Paul's letter to the Ephesians in chapter 5. It's an extraordinary vision of what Christian marriage is. And the first thing Paul says there kind of completely shocks us in terms of our modern Western sensibilities. He says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church." And we immediately think, Paul is putting women underneath men. He's denigrating women, he's pushing them down. And then we read what Paul says next. "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." How did Christ love the church? Naked and bleeding and dying on a Roman cross. That is the model for how Christian husbands are to love their wives. What Paul is telling us is that Christian marriage is actually not primarily about two people making each other happy, or even primarily about two people having babies together. It's primarily about us living a little scale model of Jesus' love for his people. And we see in the last book of the Bible, in Revelation, this great shout going out, the wedding of the Lamb has come, and we see Jesus' marriage to his church bringing heaven and earth back together. This is why marriage is male-female, and why husbands and wives are called to different roles. Like Christ in the church, it's a love across difference. Like Christ in the church, it's a love built on sacrifice. Like Christ in the church, it's a life-creating, flesh-uniting, never-ending, exclusive love. Marriage is meant to point us to Christ. But it's also meant to disappoint us. Because even the best human marriage could only ever be a tiny echo of Jesus' love for us. And actually, if we listen to what Jesus says, we'll find that marriage is not the only relationship that is designed to point us to his love. On the night that Jesus was betrayed to his death, he said this to his followers, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends." Now, if we're honest, in most of our church settings, we would have ended the sentence differently. Greater love has no one than this, than a love of a husband and a wife. Or maybe, greater love has no one than this, than the love of a mother for her children. But Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. One of the most powerful kind of mantras in our culture today is the claim that love is love. And we know that what that claim means is that the love between two men or two women could be just as faithful, just as beautiful, just as enduring as the love between a man and a woman. And as a Christian who wants to be led by what the Bible says, I would want to say both no and yes to that. I would want to say no because actually the Bible is painfully clear that same-sex sexual relationships are out of bounds for Christians. But I would want to say yes to that because actually the Bible gives us a vision for love between believers in friendship that is so much more intimate and beautiful and life-giving than we even realize. We see it in the Apostle Paul's own life and ministry. If you've ever read Paul's short letter to Philemon, in that little letter, he calls Onesimus his very heart. I don't know if Jim stood up tomorrow morning to preach, and in the course of his sermon, he mentioned a male friend of his in the congregation, and he described him as his very heart. You probably think, oh, that's a little bit intense. He's a little bit much there. That's how Paul felt about Onesimus. If you read Paul's letter to the Romans, the greetings at the end in Romans 16, don't know about you, but in the past, I've always sort of skimmed over the greeting, say hi to so-and-so, say, I don't know these people, skip to the end. But actually, if you look carefully, you'll find we can learn quite a lot about Paul's relationships from listening to what he's saying to individual people. And in his letter to the Romans, he calls multiple male friends my beloved. In his letter to the Philippians, he tells them that if Epaphroditus had died, he would have experienced sorrow upon sorrow. Now, he knew that this brother was going to go straight to the Lord if he died, and yet Paul says it would have broken his heart. We are called to a brotherly and sisterly love that is so much more real and powerful than many of us, I would want to say honestly, probably have ever experienced, and certainly maybe struggling to experience today. So it's not that the Bible doesn't have a beautiful vision for love between believers of the same sex. It actually does. But it's not the same kind of love as the vision it has for love between a man and a woman in marriage. We're familiar with the fact that in the Bible we read about God as our Father. And so in the absolute best human father, we get this tiny little echo of God's fatherly love for us. I've talked about how marriage gives us a picture of Jesus' love for his people and how that's an echo of Jesus' love for us as well, but we know that those are different kinds of love. And likewise, the kind of love that we can experience with brothers and sisters in deep, real Christian missional friendship gives us a different angle on God's love for us. Now, I'm not saying any of this sort of easy or straightforward. Those of you who've read my books will probably know this about me, but for those who haven't, spoiler alert. I've been a Christian for as long as I can remember, and for as long as I can remember, I've been attracted to other women. If I were not a Christian, it's very likely I'd be married to a woman today rather than to a man. And you might think, oh, well, that's, you must be some very sort of strange outlier. And I am strange in many ways, but not actually in this respect. I'm actually the most typical kind of person who experiences same-sex attraction. So studies have been done on the actual experiences that people have, not just the kind of labels that we may or may not attach to ourselves. And it turns out that about 14% of women and about 7% of men experience substantial attraction to folks of their same sex. Only 1% of women and 2% of men are exclusively attracted to their same sex, to where it would be, pretty much impossible for them to be married to somebody of the opposite sex. So a woman like me who is certainly attracted to the same sex, but not to the extent that I couldn't possibly be married to a man, I'm actually, as I say, like the most typical kind of person who might be kind of classified as LGBT in the kind of nomenclature of our day. I mean, the other thing that's sort of surprising or unsettling to people actually on all sides of the question here is that there's good evidence to show that people's patterns of attraction can and do change in the course of their lives. I'm not saying everybody does. Certainly substantial proportions of people who are only ever attracted to the opposite sex and that remains stable. Some people who are only attracted to the same sex and that remains stable. But actually there's quite a lot of sort of crissing and crossing that humans can experience through their lives. Turns out we're messier than we might imagine sometimes. But the reality is the question for all of us, if we're followers of Jesus, is not, are you ever attracted to somebody you're not married to? The question is, will you submit your attractions to Christ? And all of us, male or female, whatever our patterns of attraction, whether we're married or whether we're single, all of us will be needing to say no to our sexual or romantic desires at different times in our lives. We're kind of all in the same boat together. And as soon as any of us says, actually, I must have sexual or romantic fulfillment to be a sort of full human being, and Jesus doesn't have the right to tell me what to do, we're actually not recognizing who Jesus is. He's the one who says that anyone who wants to come after him must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow him. Now, as somebody who, as I say, strongly believes what the Bible says about marriage and that it's actually very clear, I didn't come to the Bible hoping to find that it said no to same-sex marriage, right? I would have been quite happy at one time in my life to have read the Bible and found a different answer. But the more I've studied these questions, the more convinced I am that it doesn't. So I didn't sort of come with that agenda, so to speak. But one of the things that I think is really important for us to do, if we are convinced of that truth, is to make our churches and our communities and our families and our friend groups places where actually Christians who experience same-sex attraction feel like they can share that experience and that they can talk about their own struggles, just like anybody else can. My guess is that in most churches, it is easier to confess a pornography addiction than to acknowledge a history of same-sex attraction. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually think it's vital that people in our churches are able to confess a pornography addiction and get the help that they need from brothers and sisters. But for years, for decades, we've left our brothers and sisters who do experience same-sex attraction kind of basically alone. We've left them shivering in the dark, feeling like they're unwanted and unloved, and nobody's wanting to hear what they're going through. And if you want to pour kind of gasoline on sexual temptation for any person, what do? You leave them alone. So one of the things I think we need to do if we are to reclaim sexuality in this generation is actually make our churches places where Christians who experience same-sex attraction feel included and embraced. And we need to make our churches places where single people, for whatever reason they're single, that they also feel included and embraced and part of the family. Too often we have spent our time elevating Christian marriage, which is this wonderful thing, points us to Jesus' love for his people. We've done so at the expense of Christian singleness. But actually Paul, who was the one who said those extraordinary things about Christian marriage being a scale model of Jesus' love for his people, he says singleness is even better. He, as a single man, was pointing to others and saying, hey, I wish you were all like me. We've completely lost the vision for singleness in our churches. And we failed to recognize that actually the single follower of Jesus can testify to Jesus' love in a very profound and important way. So as we think about how to engage on these often painful, controversial, difficult, weighty questions around sexuality, we need to make sure, as my friend Sam Albury puts it, that if somebody were to leave the LGBT community to join our church family here, that they would experience more love here, not less. We need to make sure that brothers and sisters in this church family who experience same-sex attraction and may never have actually talked to anybody about it, get the love and support that they need. Because if there's one thing that Satan wants us to believe, wants all of us to believe about ourselves, is that whatever we are struggling with, that's the one thing we can't talk to other people about. The absolute last thing he wants is what the Bible calls us to do, which is to shoulder up together with our brothers and sisters and to love each other as Christ has loved us. So as we go out with the message of the gospel, let's reclaim diversity, let's reclaim the university, let's reclaim morality, and let's reclaim sexuality. But let's do all of these things with humility. We must repent of the ways in which we've allowed racism to thrive in our churches. We must repent of the ways in which we've abandoned the life of the mind. And we must repent of the actual homophobia, the actual kind of fear and hatred of people who identify as gay or lesbian that has been part of our churches, I think, for decades. We need to take a hard turn away from ourselves and a hard turn toward the scriptures. Because Jesus is not a relic of the ancient world. He is our modern world's best hope.